Okay, John Judge, author, historian, and researcher, has spent the past 26 years examining the hidden history of the Cold War, U.S. intelligence agencies and their covert operations, as well as international fascism. While doing extensive research in mass and individual mind control, he uncovered what he believes to be the real answer or story behind the murders at Jonestown, not suicides. And he links these to a military intelligence and a CIA program called MK-Ultra. As an avid investigator into the Kennedy assassination, John Judge found links between the characters, assassins, funding, and operations in the subsequent murders of Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and numerous other public figures and eyewitnesses. Judge's 26 years of research has included detailed examination of the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Commission report and hearings, some 300 cubic feet of records in the National Archives, related books, and thousands of articles. He daily scrutinizes newspapers, such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. Judge worked on a regular basis with the well-known West Coast researcher and broadcast journalist Mae Brussel on her weekly show, World Watchers International. And I hope he's going to tell us a little bit about his experiences working with her tonight, because it's very, very interesting. After her death, he established and directed the Mae Brussel Research Center in Santa Cruz, California. Articles by John Judge have been printed in publications such as the Utne Reader, Critique, Spy, and Newsweek, and he is the author of the book Judge for Yourself, which I mentioned we have copies on the back table. His Jonestown research was recently published by Farrell House in Secret and Suppressed. He has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs and has lectured at many colleges and universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, Amherst College, University of Dayton, and the University of California at Santa Barbara. Currently, he's a resident of Washington, D.C., and is co-founder of the Committee for an Open Archives and editor of their newsletter, Prologue. As a founding member of the Coalition on Political Assassinations and producer of their newsletter, Open Secrets, Judge is a popular speaker on government intrigue and the questionable deaths of many political figures. In fact, he's just finished speaking tonight, or earlier this evening, to ASK, the Assassination Symposium on John F. Kennedy, which is held every year here in November on around the date of when Kennedy was assassinated. And I think there's probably quite a few people from the ASK conference here, and I welcome you. So now let's welcome John Judge, who is going to speak on Who Really Runs America, the Hidden History of the United States. Thank you.
We can start with a negative answer, not us. I want to say a special thanks to Cheyenne, efforts of the group of the Eclectic Viewpoint and other folks who came out tonight to help to get me here. I had also asked a longtime and well-known Kennedy researcher, Al Navis, who was at the ASK conference, to accompany me as he did in Toronto during the question and answer session. I'm not going to focus a great deal of time on the JFK assassination. I will give you my basic outline of it. I know details that could keep us here for a week, but I thought I'd add him in if you have questions about that. I want to go on to some of the other murders that no one ever talks about, and I think there are hundreds of them. My favorite cartoon for the week, and I think you learn a lot more in cartoons than you do in most of the text in the newspapers. This one has Calvin and Hobbes in the forest on a little a dead tree, and Calvin says, "Sometimes I think the surest sign that intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe is that none of it has tried to contact us." I know some of you that come here, I can tell from the Eclectic Viewpoint catalog, talk about UFOs, or think about them, or read about them, or study them. I'm not going to incorporate it into my talk, but during the Q&A, if you want to ask me, I will tell you why I refer to them as unrecognized fascist observatories. I think they are terrestrial spy technology. My book of the week, which is actually a classic, but I ran across it just at the time we came out from under these recent elections, is Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. The blurb on the back says, a blow-by-blow description of a president saving the country from welfare cheaters, sex, crime, and a liberal press by becoming a dictator. Military spokesman General Edgeways and Republican Party activist Mrs. Adelaide Tarr Gimmich sound as fresh as a CNN broadcast. So that's my recommended reading for the week. It Can't Happen Here. Another one you might try, which for me is this whole period, is Dalton Trumbo's book about the McCarthy years called The Time of the Toad. I don't know if you've ever read it. The title comes from a quote from Emile Zola, who worked hard to expose the conspiracy that surrounded the setup of another historical patsy by the name of Dreyfus in a political case. And he referred to the fact that when he went to the cafe in the morning to get his coffee and buy his newspaper, at the little stand he would spend an extra sou to buy a small toad. And then he would proceed to try to swallow the toad. If he could get the toad down, he read the newspaper. And I read them religiously, but you've got to be able to deal with toad juice. I don't think, on the other hand, that a particular secret society existing throughout all time runs the United States of America. I don't even think that a particular high cabal is in charge. I think the reality is much more subtle. I think it's best stated in Ishmael Reed's book, Mumbo Jumbo, that the real history of the world is the history of competing conspiracies. As in any human organization, I think there are always young Turks, dissenting elements, and others, and that the concentration of power and wealth in this country is not without its divisions. So when I talk about them, I'm not talking about one them or 16 people that sit in a room smoking cigars and deciding all of human history. I am talking about a tremendous historical concentration of wealth and the ability to create wealth through the technologies of production, and an increasing corporate control and similar shrinking into interlocking boards of directors of those corporations. Just to give you one example, in the 1970s, I studied congressional reports that had to do with interlocking boards of directors that showed that 60 different corporations essentially controlled all electronic media in the United States. Now it's 6 in the 1990s. And these concentrations of wealth represent, at the very least, 2 primary segments of wealth. One, the established robber baron and banking capital that marked the development of U.S. capital during the 1800s and 1900s in the hands of what's basically now called the Eastern Establishment, the old banking families, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Schiffs. There's about 60 founding families that the wealth concentrated in. But then also, I believe, equally as wealthy and as powerful in the period, especially during and at the end of World War II and since, a new economy that developed in the Southern Rim based on oil and agricultural land purchases and an entrepreneurial sector of the economy that grew up, especially around aerospace and munitions, the sale of weapons. And it's not that these don't cross over, that no one plays both sides, but I think these are at least 2 major competing factions. I think they're usually represented clearly in the presidential and vice presidential choices that get into the White House. I don't think that Ronald Reagan and George Bush are the same person. In fact, I'll tell you a little later what I think one of them did to the other. I think it also has to do with a tremendous devaluation and monopolization of currency and the issuances of currency and a centralization of the economy itself. But this concentration of wealth is at such a point now that less than 1% of the current population effectively control 98% of the stocks, well over 70% of the land mass. They are in control basically of the upward 90% of the wealth in the country. And then the remaining 90% control less than 5 to 10% of the wealth in the country. And you have this little strata in between that's kept alive with the hope through winning a lottery or hanging on to what possessions they have generally on credit, can call themselves a middle class. in that sector, but that's shrunk to, in real figures and government figures, less than 10% of the population in real terms, and shrinking faster. The gap between the wealthy and the poor is tremendous. Most of what you would consider the rich now own more money than you would even see if you could look into 100 bank teller vaults. I mean, you know, the wealth is concentrated and divided to that level. And in addition to this, there's been an increasing role of the government over those years in protecting that privilege and wealth in very concrete ways. The robber barons, for instance, Jay Gould, well-known industrialist of that period, made his fortune because the government gave him land on either side of any railroad track he built for a 10-mile space on either side of the track. Well, guess who came up along the railroad tracks? All the cities, any of the towns were able to build, and he was selling them the property as well as the railroad track to move their goods in and out in the trade. So, and this is just one example of government-controlled monopolization of the wealth, but it's hand in hand, and it led, I believe, to an endless cycle of non-productive exchange of currency through rent, usury, interest on loans, taxes, all of which produce no goods, but take money out of an otherwise healthy economy. And in general, it ended up, the vast majority of it, in foreign rather than domestic investment. When those foreign investments are threatened, those same interests then push for a militarization of the society, sell that same society not only the weapons to carry on the war, but the youth to carry it out and do the dying for it. So they profit at any end of the sector protecting these investments and their wealth. But we exist in a situation certainly during and since the end of World War II where the social hegemony, not only the profit of war, but the social hegemony of the country becomes intermingled with that militarization. As World War II comes to an end, for one example, Charles Wilson of GE, what's good for the General Electric is good for the country. He's famous for that quote. Is also famous, in my view, for the quote that in order to maintain social control at that point, we had to go to a permanent war economy, in his terms, which I think we did. Young people now, so separated from even the basics of history. I read an article the other day where World War II was described to some high school students. And one of the students was amazed to find out, well, many of them were, to find out that Japan and the United States had had a war. And one of the students raised his hand and asked, who won? It seems an amusing question from one perspective, but let's think about it. Japan and Germany demilitarized and built their industrial and economic base, and at the same time the United States and the USSR militarized, eroded their base, maintaining that mutual Cold War symbiosis. And I think it's clear in the current period which way the control is headed. The only thing that stopped it in the 1970s and has a curb on it now is something that you know as the Trilateral Commission, which was set up by David Rockefeller, a main mover in the international oil interest, because Japan and Germany, who were the two other major players in this New World axis that they created between Japan, Germany, and the United States, sort of reversing the World War II alliances, those two countries have no internal oil source. They're completely dependent on oil from outside. And at the same time, they cut off all pipeline oil into Europe, and oil now flows out of the major areas, Saudi Arabia and the new fields that they found in the southern peninsula and there, and the old Dolman Dome. That oil comes out of there not as it did through World War II in the 1940s by pipeline, but on tanker. And the tankers go out to open sea, and the ports bid for the highest oil price to decide where the tankers will port and unload their oil, artificially increasing the price of oil and creating phony shortages of oil around the world. So that, to some extent, let them then pull Japan and Germany into the world order that the U.S. industrialists and the rich here envisioned. But it won't last forever. And I think there's an argument to be made that Cold War came whole cloth from the Nazis, especially in Germany, but some in Japan as well, who were imported, not by the hundreds, but by the thousands, into the United States at the end of World War II with their ideologies and their criminal histories intact. But the industrial base here became completely interdependent with the militarization, to the extent now that even though there is no more USSR, we're still being told by the current new Republican administration that defense has to grow in the current period, that we have to go back to Star Wars, that we have to keep sinking money in for fear that we'll have an enemy in the future and we won't be ready for them, you know, or some such nonsense. And meanwhile, 60–70% of the tax dollar goes into paying for current, past, or dreamed up future wars, while the social services erode. And how can you have a situation where you're going to reduce taxes and increase the military budget if you're not going to have absolutely zero social services? I mean, that's got to be where the formula leads, and that's not what's being talked about. But this militarization, I think, has had, as Penn Jones, a researcher that I knew very well here in this area, talked about as a death grip of the military on our throats, especially in the period since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I wanted to put this in the broader context, though, not only of the wars and the weapons sales all over the world that are currently part of that profit scheme, where if you drew a globe of the people that sell and make weapons in one color and another of those who buy them and use them against each other, you'd basically have a north-south dichotomy of the world population, but also a situation where drugs and addictive substances are probably the most profitable industry on the planet, and I believe can be documented almost completely controlled by competing segments of the U.S. intelligence agencies. These drugs, to give you an example, in Harlem, one community alone in the United States, in Harlem, in one day, heroin, one substance, makes a profit of at least $1 million each day. That's one substance in one community in the United States. I mean, try to think about, and also the low overhead. I mean, they don't exactly have employee benefits, you know, no health care, actually the opposite, and a product that sells the consumer to the substance, not the other way around. Certainly not the only addictive product. Tremendous amount of money being made on tobacco, on caffeine, on alcohol and other addictive substances, but that's certainly one of the illegal drugs, the ones they make illegal to make expensive, are one of their major sources of income for covert and other operations. And these black markets grow up around them, where we're supposed to believe that for 40 years organized crime and a supposedly organized federal and local police investigative bureau are forced to coexist without any ability to untangle or dismantle each other. I mean, a young kid, 15 years old, can find the dealer in the community within 20 minutes, but it takes 20 years for the police to uncover who's selling the narcotics or to do something about it. And those 16-year-old kids that they're throwing into prison by the droves in D.C., which is where I live, in one of the model communities where the war against black youth is being called the war against drugs, those kids don't have boats and planes that fly back and forth from Colombia. I mean, they're at the very bottom of that profit level. They're the mules that carry it around for the people that actually bring it in internationally. The profit's already made by the time it hits the street. The price of being a dealer on the street to the people that are giving them and controlling the type of dope they sell and what goes in it and the price of it, their price to stay on the street is not to pay more profit. And a pound of heroin, from the time it's raw heroin to processed, or raw opium to processed heroin to the street level, has gone up by 100%. In other words, 10 times the raw value. They've already made their profit off it, so the price for the dealer is to give them information about people and political activity on the street. And that's been the case since the late 1960s, that the price of being a dealer is not only go along with what they're doing, but also you can keep the small change profit you make at that point, but you have to give them information. And not to mention the control that they get over the society, the ability to bust who they want, and the actual pollution of consciousness. I never took any of the controlled substances because I think they're all essentially poisons, as is most medicine, and I didn't want to interrupt conscious flow, you know, and insight into things. I get high enough on myself and people around me. I find most things pretty amusing, or at least revelatory. So I never, you know, tried to escape from the situation or use the drugs. I knew a lot of my friends that did, but I know that there was a qualitative difference between the experience of acid or marijuana in the late 1960s and the things that went under that name by the period of the 1970s. In fact, I was at a police conference, the Academy of Forensic Sciences, almost all of whom are police, that do ballistic work on crimes. And they had a trade show out front with a machine that could distinguish on a petri dish with a little look like a microphone passed over the dish. Not only could distinguish any amount of marijuana, but then the guy passed it over 2 different dishes with the same visible thing in them, and it made a ring on one dish and a buzz on the other. And he said, and gentlemen, it can distinguish between domestic type marijuana, ring, 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 and CIA type, bzz, bzz, bzz. Now you tell me, is that radiation? Is it chemical pollutant? It's got to be something. If you can pass it over it and it can make a distinction, it's got to be either chemical or radioactive. So what's in CIA type as opposed to domestic type marijuana? So I'd say if you want to do drugs, you better do your own, because whatever they're giving you is laced with who knows what. I always find it amusing that they say the junkies are dying in D.C. because some pure heroin got loose. And they took kids that had never taken any heroin in their life and shot them up with 3 times the dose of a long-term addict, daily dose, and they don't OD. You OD and you have these deaths on what the junkies call white lightning, which is something introduced into the drug, you know, whether it's battery acid or a lot of they do with talc and somewhat harmless substances. But when you're dying from a drug overdose, on cocaine even, in the Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s and since, those were kept in the open homicide files as unsolved murders because they know you can't OD on pure heroin or pure cocaine. Plus, who on earth, making a profit by cutting dope with other stuff, is going to put out purer dope on the street by mistake? I mean, it's just ludicrous, but that's what they tell us when we have a rash of junkies dying from a bad batch of the drugs, that they must have gotten the pure stuff. The people at the top can get the pure stuff because they have enough money to pay for it. And then I think you have to ask the question of what did they overdose on? What did Jimi Hendrix overdose on? What did Janis Joplin overdose on? Or the people that didn't have to buy street drugs but could get purer drugs? What was it that killed almost every counterculture musician that appeared at Big Sur in the late 1960s in these overdose instances? There's also a situation, I mean, that technology has now outstripped the need for labor. And if you can't see that in the current shape of the labor unions and other sorts of struggles, it seems to me you could at least see it in the unemployment lines and in the growth of the people that exist on every street in any major city, you know, in large segments who've gone through perhaps the military, the psychiatric institutions, the prisons, the various social catchment agencies that they have for people that act out in a particular way or dump back out in the street or have long-term addictions. The fact of the matter is they don't need us. We're in the position of the miners in the 1930s in the mines who were told that if the cave begins to collapse, push the mules out first as you come. Why? Because it costs money to replace a mule. We can hire somebody else. And Jay Gould said quite perceptively and horribly, I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. And they are in a position now, and they have been at other points in history, where they don't need us. They've got a technology that where the surplus not hidden, and where it used to meet human needs, could house and clothe and feed everyone on the planet. And with a very small amount of labor. But to hide that, instead, they create tremendous concentrations of wealth, false shortages, and the destruction even of the means of production through the exercise of war, and also the destruction of the population that goes along with this. There was a study done by Rand Corporation, which I unearthed in 1968, that said that for the Earth to be a livable place, they had to destroy at least half of the world's population by the end of the century. And these weren't studies that were just done for fun. They were paid for millions of dollars by U.S. government and these intelligence agencies. And if you don't think that has anything to do with the genocide around the world that's carried out by the U.S. military, you don't think it has anything to do with the AIDS and other diseases that are ravaging communities, you haven't looked at the history of these intelligence agencies and what they're capable of. The definition of fascism, to me, is not anti-Semitism. It's not racism. It's an economic and political reality that existed in the Ruhr Valley wealth of Germany in the 1930s and the developed technology that they had there that did all the things that I'm just talking about. That devalued the wealth to the point they were carrying around in wheelbarrows, that concentrated the wealth into 2% of the population, that militarized the society, that created a tremendous system of commoditization where everything, every human interaction became commoditized. As my friend Carl Chatsky in Baltimore says, what this system does is it alienates us from every form of human experience, profoundly alienates us from those communications, experiences, whatever they are, any interaction, and then sells that experience back to us in its most distorted form. So that human sexuality, as one example, is sold back as pornography. That's just one example of the many ways in which it is done. Commoditization reaching its peak in Nazi Germany meant that as the Jews were taken into the chambers, or the others in the 13 million member Holocaust, there were 6 million Jews, the largest ethnic group, not the only ethnic group. The Gypsies were taken as an ethnic group. The first people killed were not the Jews, but a tremendous Holocaust. But as they took them into the camps, they would take the gold from their teeth, they would take the rings from their fingers, they would cut the hair from their head, and eventually they would even use the fat from their burned bodies in the crematoria as what? As products, as reusable or recyclable commodities. And we are not, I mean, to me, much further along, you know, not only at that point, but much further along in terms of the whole spectrum of how we commoditize human relations. And if you don't understand, if you can watch the movie Cabaret and understand that relation of the fascists in the background and not understand that the current cabaret singer for the fascist state is named Madonna and what she's doing to your head, and you don't understand the media and you don't understand what's happened in the country. And they sell it all to you under the false idea that it's some kind of freedom. The scope of the genocide that we've carried out, not only in the past, because we have both the genocide of Native American people and the even broader genocide of African peoples that were brought here in the slave trade, but in addition to that ongoing genocide of those racial groups, we have been responsible, and this is the ex-CIA, people like Stockwell and the others admit, that we're responsible through the CIA since the end of World War II for at least 10 million deaths from covert operations and wars that were carried out by U.S. intelligence agencies. What's changed is not the ideology. What's changed is the technology of death. The technology of death has gotten worse. It's gotten much more efficient. I mean, imagine what a neutron bomb or a nuclear weapon would have done in that period in terms of wiping out sectors of the population. You don't have to pick the person up and put them into the crematoria. You can drop the crematoria from the sky. Okay, so the technology of death and your ability to aggrandize it and take it further increases it. General Reinhard Gehlen, a top spy and mover in the Nazi state, the head of Army's East intelligence on all of Soviet Union for Hitler, a person who brought himself and 300 of his top spies intact to the United States to form the Central Intelligence Agency under Allen Dulles and the others that helped him get here, wrote in his notebooks at the end of World War II that the concentration camps were literally and physically too messy, too smelly, too much of a problem in terms of transportation and waste disposal, and that the real solution, he felt, would be to create natural disasters that would kill large numbers of people in a short period of time. I studied the Stockholm Weapons Conference that's held annually by these weapons makers. In 1976, I got the minutes, and this is 20 years ago. They were already talking about not only lights that would blind you and sounds that would deafen you from the sky, but they were also talking about the possibility of creating floods, of creating earthquakes and other types of natural disaster by putting fluids down into the fault lines, eroding salt deposits underneath the ground so that it would collapse, exacerbating with heat from satellites, droughts in certain areas to clear out those areas for human population and move people around. And by the end of World War II, they already knew where the major concentrations of raw materials that they wanted were, and they already knew how compliant or non-compliant the populations sitting on them were, and they had a whole defense industries board on resources set up in order to study that and how to take control of it. So the fight has been to get a grip on as much of those commodities as they can and to either use the local population or eliminate it. History itself, I believe, can be argued, especially since the period in World War II, has become a commodity owned not by us, but by the national security state, essentially stolen by us from that national security state. To give you one example, the history of World War II, that's classified, as well as the history of the Cold War, is stored in a National Military Archive, part of the archives in Washington, D.C. This particular one is based in Suitland, Maryland. It's stored in underground vaults. Do you remember that last scene in Raiders of the Ark with Indiana Jones and the guy pushing the one carton amidst thousands of cartons in this long hall? That's what we're talking about. Underground vaults, an acre in size, presumably loaded to the fill. Otherwise, you know, go on to the next one. 27 such vaults in this collection. 27 acres of at least 2 stories of classified documents just for the period from 1945. When I was in school, I don't know about you, history ended, if I was lucky prior to college, it ended at the Civil War. If I got into college and got beyond that, it ended somewhere around the beginning of World War II. There was no such thing as history that was taught in the period from 1945 to the 1960s when I was going to school. That was a period, in mystery, we were told if we asked about it that it was too close for historians to evaluate. But that was the most critical period in terms of how we got here, and now we have generations of students in most high schools across the country who are not even required to take history courses because they don't want them to understand their history. If you read the book 1984, one of the delusions that Winston Smith, the protagonist, is forced to suffer under is that he doesn't even know what year it is. And I would suggest we don't know what year it is either, because George Orwell, whose real name is Eric Blair, who was an agent of the Indian Imperial Police and part of Burma, the first counterinsurgency war, and learned the tricks of the trade from the British, who held an effective empire control with intelligence methodology for 500 years and then taught it to us because we didn't know how to do it. This guy came out of their ranks and told a story in that book in 1939 when he wrote it that he titled in the first English editions 1948. It was only when it hit U.S. shores through Harcourt Brace, which also had ties to the intelligence agency by that point, that the title was changed for American consumption into 1984, that the past at that point was made into the future. So the book, and one of the revelations in the book, horrifying to Winston, is that the Book of Revolution, which is a very interesting, read the book within the book in 1984 because it will tell you much of what I'm talking about here. But that Book of Revolution, supposedly written by the state enemy Goldstein, who I think you can read Rosenberg, that book, in the end, it turns out, has been written by O'Brien, the head of the Ministry of Truth, who's torturing Winston and just given to him in order to see how he would react to it. So I think that much of even the alternate history is disinformation, but history itself is taken from us, and peoples that don't have their own history are a conquered peoples. How does this control that I'm talking about happen, besides just the absolute concentration of wealth and power, the ability to make social decisions well beyond us that aren't open to any democratic input? I mean, democracy to me, a system of democracy, would be a situation where the people affected by any given decision would make that decision. And I think you can just take that, I don't think that's an outre definition, and apply that to your own life and give me a sense of whether you think you live in a democracy. I think you live in a situation where you go every once in a while to the polls to deal with a situation I call the evil of two lessers. And most of you don't go to the polls because you know that there's nothing there to vote for anyway. There's not a real difference twixt the two outside of perhaps somebody asked me the morning after the Republican victory, you know, what do you think it means? I said, we're in the same handbasket on the way to hell on the same track, but the Democrats use a handbrake on the side and the Republicans knock it off and go full speed. So you get a little bit of a slowdown, but you get basically the same program, and you certainly don't get any input on deciding anything about what's going to happen for the next 4 years or 2 years, because after you elect that person, clearly they have become the people. Do any of you have a congressional or Senate representative that comes to you, calls you, or writes to you and tries to poll your opinion about anything? Do you ever get a result from that poll? Is it ever compared with the votes that they make in the congressional elections? You know, one thing that you could do very simply in any given community is to add you know, send everybody who has an address in your community a 3-piece carbon form and a return envelope. And put in a brochure that draws a pie and shows them how their tax dollars are currently being spent on the federal and local level. And then give them a blank pie to fill in and say how they want their tax dollars spent. It has no legal status. Take the top copy off and throw it in with their tax returns in April. Take the middle copy off and put it in the envelope and send it back to you, and keep the third one for amusement or their drawer or whatever they want to do with it. Tally those, make up a pie that the people have given you, put it next to the pie of the representative of the people has given you, and ask the representative to come out and explain who it is that he's representing. And I assure you, you'll get some interesting neo-colonialist attitudes from these people who know best how to spend your money. I don't think there's even the attempt on the part of most of them to represent, but I think even a well-meaning person, I would not run for an office to represent the rest of you in this room. How could I? In a society this large and this complex, I mean, in the 1700s, you know, the fruit wasn't that far from the tree, but they didn't have anything except a wagon or a horse and some mail. And so you had to send somebody for a couple of weeks to go to Philadelphia or New York from North Carolina to find out what was happening and make sure that you got represented there, or your point of view was put forward. And so you loaded somebody onto the cart. Probably you picked the SOB you like to have around the least so you could get back to business, you know, and put them on their way to the Continental Congress. You know, Ben Franklin stood up at the end of the Congress and said, "Gentlemen, you might have noticed that outside these walls, trade and commerce and people's lives continue. We best be about finishing our business before they realize they don't need us." Okay, and so they would come back with this representation, but we have instantaneous communication now. We have television and we have computers. We have almost instantaneous travel. We don't need them. In fact, they're in the way. And we should be making decisions directly with a direct information flow. But pardon me, I talk of democracy, and no sense Alice in Wonderland. Let's talk about where we are. The control comes, I think, besides the concentration of wealth and ability to make these decisions without your input, also through propaganda, a tremendous amount of propaganda, a control of the flow of information itself, so that information is a commoditized entity that's economized and manipulated, and through disinformation, that's a conscious distortion of information, so that if you get close to the truth, there are ways to confuse you, wiggling fingers so that you don't notice the palm that's behind the thing. Also, a creation, I believe, of false standards of credibility and acceptability, almost to the extent, and don't need to accept this, but my point of view, generally, my rule of thumb is if you've heard of somebody, they're probably no damn good. Because the people I know that do real work on a community level or try to change things, they never get any press. They never get anywhere near the media, and the people that are touted as the great leadership have nothing to do with the people that are actually suffering the problems. They come out of some institution or school or nonprofit agency, they're funded by the government, and they're suddenly the spokesperson for the movement or the social concern, and I find their statements 100 degrees from the people that are actually trying to deal with the problem. So we deal with these experts, and the people that aren't experts, like myself, are of course not worth listening to. Similar audiences pay $2,000 to hear ex-CIA agents, because they're credible, tell them how the intelligence agencies work. Let me suggest to you that if someone in a position to know in the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency, some of the most genocidal agencies on the face of the planet, were to walk out of those agencies and try to tell you the truth about what those agencies do and have done in their whole history, that person wouldn't last a week. And I can give you examples of people who tried to tell a small piece of that truth and didn't last. You can't walk and talk from the CIA anymore. You can walk and talk from the mafia. It's the same game, and it's a bigger game and a lot more at stake. So the people that you get out as ex-intelligence agents have to be, number one, so low on the totem pole that they don't know anything anyway, so let them blab. Number two, somebody that's planted by one segment of the intelligence community to think on the other section, and their rear end is covered by that section that's supporting them to go out there and position that. Number three, the loyal critics, the ones that are sent out whole cloth from the agencies to pretend to be the opposition so that the real opposition never gets heard, and to take notes and see who comes and who's interested. Or number four, as I suggest, the guy who really wants to tell the truth, who's up for grabs and doesn't last very long. It's very hard to get a message out beyond this level of the propaganda. Goebbels, I would suggest, Hitler's propagandist, would have cut off his saluting arm for television. And television is the major method of control that they have over what Orwell called the space between our ears, the last frontier that's left for them to conquer. During a period in the 1970s, Edward Kennedy and some of the other Congress members tried to stop massive levels of lobotomization that was going on in the psychiatric institutions of this country. In the 1950s, 1960s, up to that period in the early 70s, 10,000 children under the age of 10 each year were being lobotomized in children's psychiatric wards across the country. Okay, and a tremendous amount of lobotomization. This one doctor had developed a technique where you could go in around the eye instead of cutting the skull open, a transorbital knife, and cut the ganglia in a couple of seconds. He's depicted in the movie Frances, about Frances Farmer, if you've never seen it, an actress who acted out a little bit too much in front of a bunch of patriarchs and was an early feminist, and so she got dragged into the hellholes of the psychiatric institutions, drugged out, and then this guy came across her, put her on a stretcher in front of a bunch of medical students to show them how easy it was, and took out the last of her emotive affect. First I knew of lobotomy. I grew up in Washington, D.C. area, but in the suburbs called Falls Church, which is the bedroom community of Langley, the CIA headquarters, the Pentagon over in Arlington, and the surrounding National Security Agency and Defense Agency. I grew up in that neighborhood of the shadow government. I knew from a very early age that different things were going on. The first I knew of lobotomy, or even psychiatry itself, at the age of about 9 or 10, I asked my mother about the other wives in the neighborhood, because a number of them had a very flat affect and they didn't react normally to me when I was playing or talking to them. And she said, oh, they've been lobotomized. In other words, in the CIA community, we had Stepford wives. That's who I grew up around. And I found those women later in movements against lobotomy and electroshock. I found one woman after some hearings where they were trying to make electroshock machines into, and put them under FDA as generally safe machines, despite what they do. There was a little group of women who just wanted a truth in psychiatry, they called, and they wanted you to be able to sign a release saying that you knew what it might do to you. You know, just informed consent. They weren't able to get that. I sat down with this woman at the little picnic they had after the hearing, and she revealed to me that she had electroshock and that she couldn't remember for a period of almost 19 years what she had been doing, but eventually her memory had come back to her. And she said that her husband had put her into the institution when she came out of the military, and that she had been working during the period in World War II for the U.S. Navy, specifically for U.S. Navy intelligence, that her job was a decoding cryptanalyst. She was someone who broke codes. And she said to me, sitting on this little bench, and it probably wouldn't have had the impact, may not on you, she turned to me and said, I broke the East Wind Code. I don't know if anyone in the audience knows what the East Wind Code is. That was the code that had to do with prior warning of the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese. This is the woman who decoded that message. Now, there's some argument historically about whether it ever reached the president. That goes back and forth, but it clearly was decoded, and this is the woman that did it. Do you think it's a coincidence that after her discharge, she just happened to be put in for electroshock? Do you think it was the way that she acted around her husband, or maybe it was something that she knew? And I could give you many examples that I've found of that sort of thing, first in my neighborhood and beyond, of direct debriefing in that sense. But in addition to the general message of television, which is a message that cops are better than people. Almost every show on television is about cops. Even Star Trek is about space cops. I mean, you just have to decode it a little bit in order to get it, that it's either cop shows or it shows that in the guise of bringing people together, teach them how to hate each other, whether it's women or white and black or whatever it is, and make everybody look like an idiot. I mean, they can't have a show that doesn't have violence as the final solution to human problems because they don't know of any other way to solve it on their level. And they bring all of that forward in the television, along with this entertainment that they call news. But beyond that level of just the control of the message, do you know that every day across the whole world, satellites broadcast subliminal messages and information through all electronic broadcasts of both television and radio? And I have articles in publications like Scientific American in the 1960s about this, where they interviewed the scientists, and they said, do you do these? And they said, yes, and what's it for? He said, well, we impart educational information and health information, you know, around the world. And he said, well, couldn't this be used for political purposes? And the scientist says, oh, of course. If nothing else, probably one of the messages is buy, buy, buy. I don't know if any of you have seen this film, Them, that's about an alien invasion. and the few human rebels that catch on, they have these little sunglasses they put on, and suddenly they can see the aliens aren't people, that they're aliens. The other thing that they see is that all the headlines of Time and Newsweek, all the covers of the magazines, and all the billboards have subliminal messages on them telling them to, the basic message, which my friend Lori in San Francisco wears in a little button all the time, says, keep quiet, consume, and die. That's the basic hidden message underneath, in case you wonder what they're sending you. But mass media, corporate control of media, basically became an uncontested reality in the 1930s. There was actually a mass political movement in the 1930s across many lines to stop the possibility of a corporation, a corporate entity, buying a radio band or having any control. And so now we have 100% almost control, entrepreneurial control, except these little stations where you can go and show something for an hour, or so-called community-controlled stations, that no one listens to. But the major stuff is all corporate-owned in a very few hands. I think that the reality in 1948, when televisions came into the American homes, is the reality of 1984. It is the reality of the telescreen. When Hale Boggs, a member of the Warren Commission, died, I was interested in his death. He died in this plane crash in the middle of Watergate in Alaska. I went to his staff to talk to them as they were cleaning out his office, and I asked them what they had been working on. Hale Boggs was one of the few members of the Warren Commission that dissented. And there's a point in there in the record where he says to Earl Warren, just put a little footnote in there by that sentence that Oswald did it and say that Hale Boggs doesn't necessarily agree. And Warren pounded on the table and said, gentlemen, we have to have unanimity in this matter, and shut him up. Hale Boggs was also the one that suggested that if they just put out the report without putting out any of the evidence, that people might not buy it. He said he thought they'd think it was a little fishy. So they talked about it a little bit, and Alan Dulles finally said, well, go ahead and put out some of the evidence. Nobody will read it anyway. A few of us read it, but there was a nice cartoon about the Wizard of Id that showed the king and the soldier walking along, and the soldier says, sire, the illiteracy rate is way up. And the king says, oh, good. And the soldier says, why is that? He said, we can get rid of censorship. And I think we're being brought into an illiterate society, a society that doesn't know how to read, even to the point now that we find that the FBI want librarians to report on them, to them about who's taking what books out of the library. And suddenly that's subversive activity, to read anything, because they only want you to have the quick message, the totally controlled message. And so, and books certainly go out of print. But I found out that they were, in Hale Boggs' office, that they were working on something called Operation Octopus, that it dated to the late 40s, 48, 49, and that it was a capability, any television set that was plugged in, so the tubes were hot, because these are the old tube sets, that they had the capability within a 25-mile radius to get both audio and visual signals out of the television set. That they would take these units in and could see into the living rooms. And they were doing congressional investigation into this. It was apparently some kind of real program. They must have had miniaturization of the cameras. It may seem unbelievable to you, but I would suggest to you that you don't know the technology that exists now. In 20 years, you'll be told about that technology because the next level exists. I think William S. Burroughs, the writer, is exactly correct. He says that if Magellan was an American today and he sailed around the planet tomorrow and he suddenly discovered that the world was round instead of flat, we wouldn't tell anybody so we could attack from the rear. Henry Kissinger in White House years says that history, to be successful, must be negotiated in absolute secrecy. This is the mentality of the people that run this situation, and there's no reason that they would tell you about a technological development they didn't have to, because not only does it mean profit, but it also means control. I was told by people that my idea that I got from the World Weapons Conference that they could cause a drought by heat from a satellite was ridiculous, that they'd have to have 10 square miles of mirror surface up on the satellite. There was no satellite so big to collect the solar energy. And then I read, on page 47, 2 years later, that they had these little tubes that were about 6 feet long, and they had mirrors directed, and it bounced the sunlight around. It was equivalent of 36 square miles of mirror surface on the side of a tiny satellite. I mean, I'm not an expert in technology. I'm not a scientist. I try to use common sense at what I look at, but I did find something called Operation Match in American Science magazine during Vietnam, and apparently the deeper purpose of all the herbicides in the Agent Orange was to desiccate the forests so that they could then, from satellite, Project Match, start forest fires that would create huge conflagrations in the areas that they were working on. Apparently, for some reason, it didn't work out, you know, didn't take, but I think they have that capability. And then they went beyond, in World War II and since, to much more direct control. And that control was exhibited not only in terms of controlling behavior, but trying to control personality itself, to create second personalities, to create or destroy memory or false memory, and to encourage violence and the capability of murder or assassination. This is all under a general rubric in the government of MK Ultra. It was started, though, in World War II. The people most responsible for it in those years were people like B.F. Skinner, working for Army intelligence, who later wrote the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, as if we don't know what's beyond there, that we can't read the message at the gates of Auschwitz, that the only way human situations or society can be changed is through direct control of the behavior with conditioning. He worked with pigeons in those years, trying to teach them to be reconnaissance elements for the government, but he also extrapolated and tested human behavioral control. Other major people in the psychological warfare and mind control in World War II, working for a combination of ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, and the OSS, were Edwin Lansdale, Alan Dulles, who also was aware of this. In fact, I found in the archives in 1969 a letter written to Earl Warren from Alan Dulles, head of the CIA, until he was fired by Kennedy, member of the Warren Commission. And this letter said that since 1948, they had an ongoing program of psychological control and manipulation for political purpose. What he was talking about was the Manchurian candidate capability, the ability to control a killer. The idea that there was a search for 30 years that was fruitless for a Manchurian candidate is a lie being told to you in a cover book by John Marks. They had that capability from World War II forward. But again, it's hidden technology. These people are significant because the main ones that worked on it, along with Lansdale, were none other than another ONI operative, Richard Milhouse Nixon, and a third person by the name of C.D. Jackson. These people figure into a great deal of the Cold War ideology and mythology. Nixon eventually, of course, picked and risen to the position of president by the Committee of 100, which included Prescott Bush and other rich industrialists that primed him out. He was supposed to win the 1960 election, and they did everything they had to, including killing a president, to get him back in. One of the reasons that JFK died. C.D. Jackson, you may remember, worked for the Loose Empire, Time and Life magazine, its major propagandist for the Cold War, telling them the Dulles brothers' Cold War lie to the rest of us. It was C.D. Jackson, editor of Life magazine, that published the fake photos of Oswald in the backyard holding the rifle and the gun. There were photos taken of him in the backyard, but I don't believe that the pictures that we saw were the ones that were taken there. I think that these were photos that were staged. And this was in order to frame him. And that was C.D. Jackson there. Interestingly, those three people are also central to the movement of the entire Belarusian government, the White Russian government, the Nazi fledgling and quisling government, the pro-fascist government and anti-communist government of Belarusia, 300 strong, into the United States to form what? Radio Free America and Voice of America and elements in the CIA. They were brought here under something called the Belarus Secret by these three people. Nixon moved after the end of the war with naval intelligence to Jay Gould's castle on Long Island, where he was responsible for hiding and then immigrating Nazi war criminals into the United States. And was part and parcel of a much larger operation to bring fascists into the country. And Lansdale certainly cooperated with that. Lansdale, among other things, his covert operations all around the world, is identified by Fletcher Prouty, who knew him quite well, as one of the people visible in the tramp photos in Dealey Plaza. He's not one of the tramps. He's heading the other way, but he's walking right next to the three tramps in between the two police officers. And somebody at the level of Lansdale, top-level military intelligence, walking through Dealey Plaza just at that moment, I hope you'll grant me, you know, a lot of people call me a conspiracy theorist. I said, that's all right if you call everyone else a coincidence theorist. I happen to be an alternate historian, I believe, and I'll give you the facts and the reasons why I believe what I do, but I'm coming from a position of having done the research. And these things don't strike me as what Penn Jones used to call happenstance. I think things happen for a reason. So you have a link to both the assassination of Kennedy and the movement of these Nazis in these three people that were responsible for developing some of the post-war mind control techniques. Memory was a big deal with them, not only in terms of getting you to release your memory to them in an interrogation, in other words, to truth serum you or strip you of what you knew, but also to debrief you in terms of short or long-term amnesia so that you wouldn't remember having been part of a covert operation. And these became standard techniques in debriefing once they were perfected. But it took a great deal of experimentation to perfect them over a period of years. But believe me, they were well along by even the mid-50s. In 1956, Allen Dulles, then in the CIA, approached the head of Sandoz shortly after the discovery of LSD-25 to purchase some of it, and he sent an order to them for 100 million tabs of LSD. Now, I would suggest to you in 1956, this is not experimental level. 100 million tabs is field level. You don't need that many to find out what the stuff does. I mean, you'd have to experiment for the next 50 years. And I don't think they're either that slow or that dumb. They already knew some of what they thought it could do, and they bought enough to use after they combined it with other things. They tried it with electroshock. They had all kinds of experiments on who? On captive populations. The VA wards, the psychiatric wards of the VA, other psychiatric wards, prisons. They tested it on soldiers in the field. They tested it at Edgewood Arsenal without the knowledge of the people, no informed consent, didn't even know they were in an experiment. Human guinea pigs for defense purposes to see what it would do. And they developed something called EA179 out of psilocybin that has some sort of control elements. They developed some type of an acid that's a control drug, and I don't know any of you have ever taken acid or pure acid, like the stuff that was out in the 1960s, but I would suggest to you that I don't know anybody who had an experience with that stuff as a control drug. I don't think you could give somebody acid, put them on an 8-hour acid trip, and then try to tell them what to do. Okay, I don't think it works that way. I don't think it's a controlled drug. But interestingly enough, by the time Charlie Manson was in his prison cell next to the main snake oil salesman for acid, Tim Leary, he whispered across the cell space, you take acid, why don't you use it to control people? So they obviously were giving Charlie something that he could control the women with, that they told him was acid, but what was it really? We found out 2 days after the murder of the Tates that the main dealer for the Manson family was suddenly able to cut his hair, put his walking shoes back on, straighten his tie, and go to the Defense Language Institute at Monterey and work for Navy intelligence. So somebody was giving him, I think, some other kind of a drug. His name was Charles Watson, and he was the dealer, but he suddenly had another, he was no longer a reconnaissance hippie drug dealer. He suddenly turned into a Navy intelligence operative. And I think that Leary himself, a graduate of West Point, who made his career in psychology and psychiatry there at Yale under the tutelage of the guy that developed, his name is Harry Edwards, he developed the psychological profile that was used to pick likely CIA agents out of the general population. And Leary helped him with that experimentation, that Leary was not all he seemed, and Leary was, in fact, someone that was used along with G. Gordon Liddy, who he later befriended, even though Liddy busted him and supposedly was his great enemy. He befriended him and traveled around the country in chummy debates in the 1970s. They suddenly liked each other. Liddy, a nativist American fascist, who once said that to love your fatherland was no crime, and suggested that the people dying in Brazil, the native peoples, deserved it because if you hadn't evolved far enough to outrun a bullet, you deserved to die somehow. These people were just being hunted down in the jungles, and I mean, he went into the prison, he played Nazi music in his cell, and sang the Horst Wessel song, and got excited. I mean, he stood up in a Washington theater one time when he saw Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, and he stood up shouting in German. He got so excited. So this is Tim Leary, the great acid head, drop out and, tune in. The great freedom guy travels around with this fascist, and they have a chummy little debate and make a joke with each other. Well, I'd suggest something else is going on, but they They bought more LSD in the 1950s for Alan Dulles than Tim Leary ever dreamed of giving you or me, and they knew what they were doing with it. They worked in Holmesburg Prison on Project Often, which was long-term memory. Cameron for the CIA and Defense Intelligence monies was in this too. This is both sides, military intelligence and CIA, doing this jointly. This guy that was the head of not only the Canadian Psychiatry Association, but the World Psychiatric Association, Ewan Cameron, did these nice experiments called psychic driving, where with white noise and other techniques, he would drive out your conscious memory of your personality and your self-identity, and then take some time putting back in a second one. There was a woman who was famous in the 1950s as a model worldwide, you know, sort of like, I don't know who to give you an example now, but top models that are in the news. Her name was Candy Jones. She later married Long John Neville, the radio announcer, and they got in touch with her through an old school chum who was a military officer. He asked her to do a job for her country. Being patriotic, she showed up at his office. He put her under hypnosis unwittingly. He then injected through IV into her arms, and it took several years of hypnotic deprogramming to get her back to these memories. He put an IV drip into her arm with psychohypnotic drugs, and he created in Candy Jones a second personality that was totally under the control of himself and the intelligence agencies that then proceeded to use her. They could call this up by shining a flashlight in her eye, calling her on their phone and giving her a certain message. And when the personality began to crack through and Long John Neville was worried about it and was trying to get her to go and see somebody, years later, she got a phone call at home, and then he luckily came home early from work and found her in the bathtub with her wrist slashed. They were able to program in neurotic behavior, including suicide, on command, and they were able to give her a personality she had no memory of, and she'd act under the one as a courier and go and do these things, and it'd just be lost time to her. For you abductee enthusiasts, I ask you to put this into your formula of understanding what that experience might be. They were able to create a personality that, as distasteful it is, I think the story is telling about their level of, you know, crassness. They had her go appear naked before a group of psychiatric students, and ordered her under the hypnotic control and her other personality to stuff carrots up her genital parts. And you know, they found that an amusing use of this psychiatric manipulation to be public about. And but they could create both short and long-term memory. One of the funniest articles I had was something about a CIA project in the study of long-term memory dissolution, and they had records of it that came out in the 1970s, and the press asked the agency, and they confirmed from the records that they had had such an experiment, but no one could remember anything about it. They also worked, in the Navy especially, to program in violence. They took people and tried to inure them to their natural reactions to human violence. They did this like Clockwork Orange. They put their head in a clamp, they forced their eyes open with drops to keep their eyes wet, they forced them to watch certain films, and the films were, or slideshows were of tremendous violence, like people being roasted over a pit, and instead of asking about what they were seeing, they said, what color is the tree in the background? What sort of hat is the man wearing? You know, just details that would have no emotional control until they programmed out the natural response of somebody to a horrible death. Then they programmed in racist attitudes toward the country or society they were going to send them into to do the killing, and they asked the Army to provide these people based on their Rorschach tests of who had certain types of aggressive and passive personalities that they could use for this killing. And this brain training of assassins was described openly in the London Sunday Times, but the article never made the American press. It was done both in Naples, Italy at an Army base, and in San Francisco at the Letterman Army Hospital by particular people that had long-term connections with U.S. intelligence. So they were training and programming assassins and that capability for a long time. They were building in separate memories. And they took it from that individual control and what uses it had for covert operations and for debriefing, I believe, by the time of Jonestown at least, into the mass control or the field level situation to see if they could control a whole segment of the population. A lot of this thinking that they had in doing this came directly also from the Nazi states. In fact, electroshock and lobotomy were developed in fascist Italy and fascist Spain during the years of the control of the fascists in those countries. The very first human experimentation in electroshock happened under the direction of Dr. Joseph Mengele at the Auschwitz concentration camp. These were Nazi methods of psychiatry, but psychiatry itself and eugenics were in those days intermeshed so that the world societies for those two great pseudosciences of the 20th century were locked together, and they believed that all psychiatric disorder was genetically based. Carl Jung, the famous German psychiatrist, had a journal that the translation of the title is Racial Hygiene and Sociobiology. Well, we have people now talking about sociobiology. You can find articles in Time magazine. They've just discovered the gene for schizophrenia. You know, I challenge them to find the germ that causes the other diseases, you know, when they dissect the body. But they come up with these things from time to time. It isolates a segment of the population, and the logical extension of this eugenic and psychiatric mesh in the Nazi years, and even earlier here in the United States in 1928, was to begin to isolate, sterilize, and then murder the segments of the population that were thought to carry the bad seed. As in animal husbandry, you might try to program in or wipe out certain parts of the gene pool. This was applied in a logical and scientific way to the human community. The first people to die in Nazi Germany were not the Jews or the Gypsies or even the communists or the anarchists or the political enemies of the state. 700,000 went to their death before that. Inmates of the psychiatric prisons, the psychiatric institutions. They set up 6 killing centers in 1937 and 1938 in Nazi Germany, and they passed mass sterilization laws. And they forced sterilization of people first, and then they went to what they called the euthanasia program, where they took the people out. They had vans come called the Public Benefit Transportation Society, and they loaded the people into the vans, took them to the killing centers, and those psychiatrists developed the crematoria and the gas chambers, the technology of the Holocaust. And they used those killing centers in the late 30s to develop the techniques, and they were used as experts then at Bergen-Belsen and at Auschwitz and at the camps all across Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe to take the Holocaust to the broader segment. Why were these people expendable? Because they were the segment of the society, I believe, that was no use to the labor, and they were considered useless eaters, non-productive, the Untermenschen of the German ideology. But the ideology goes deeper. If you go to Nuremberg and you hear the Nazi defense, and I don't say it's a defense, but it was what they said. Their defense was, why are you taking us to task for these things? You taught us how, you Americans. You taught us about genocide. You taught us about concentration camps and reservations for your native peoples. You taught us in 1928 to pass mass sterilization laws. It came from you. And it did come from the international meshing of these world psychiatric and eugenic societies. And then those Nazi psychiatrists were covered for what they did, for the killing that they participated in. That was all forgotten. And they became another group of immigrants to the United States. And my friend Lenny Lappin, who wrote the book Mass Murderers in White Coats, Psychiatric Genocide in Nazi Germany and the United States, documented by going through the entire APA directories in the 1950s the movements of these key Nazis. And he called these Nazi psychiatrists and asked them about their past. And there's some rather revealing conversations where they eventually come to this point of what we like to call between us a Nazi stutter. I didn't know what was going on at that time. You know, when old Nazis can't remember what they did during the war, Lenny and I call it Walzheimer's disease. But they did some horrible things, and then they brought those things and those ideas, and their textbooks are still the basis of German psychiatry and much of American psychiatry today. They're considered experts by presidential commissions up to the current date. Their racist ideologies and attitudes carry weight in social programs, especially against black and Hispanic and youth of color in this country. And they inform the network of psychiatry and its control. And many of these things have been reintroduced, but they were brought here, and their ideas held sway. These Nazis also came not only to teach us that, but to teach us aerospace and munitions and a technology of war that the Nazis had excelled in, that we had no idea how to control. And so instead, in 1943, at the time of the fall of Stalingrad, Allen Dulles and other American intelligence personnel, cut deals with these Nazi intelligence agents, went in and looked for the top scientists and assured them that once the war had ended, they would have a place to hide in the United States or elsewhere around the world. They would be taken care of. And those deals were consummated then in 1945 to 1948 with the importation of these Nazis. Their war criminal records were expunged by elements in the Army intelligence community. The 917th Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army Intelligence in Europe began the rat line. Klaus Barbie moved along it, but so did thousands of other Nazis. The displaced persons camps created false Glochenspiel ID cards, plastic ID for the Nazis in the period, so the criminals could hide within the camps before they were transported and not be found by other intelligence agencies and our own elements that were honest looking for them. Their Nazi pasts and their crimes were buried so that we could use them for what we thought was important. And this was the 917th Counterintelligence Corps, among other people, included not only Henry Kissinger in its ranks, but Theodore Shackley, a name you may have heard in connection with the Contragate scandal, and even J.D. Salinger was a member of the 917th. It's a group worth studying because they were instrumental, among others. A top Rockefeller banking lawyer became the Allied High Commissioner of Germany in the civilian period following the war, ran the civilian government until the German government took over, and pardoned hundreds of the key Nazi criminals. Not that many Nazi criminals ever went to trial, much less were hung or spent any time in prison. These people were let off the hook because they took care of the Cold War interests of the United States. They took care of their technological needs. And the guy that pardoned many of them was John J. McCloy, himself, like Allen Dulles, a member of the Warren Commission, covering up then the direct role, I believe, of these Nazis in the murder of John F. Kennedy. The murder of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963 has every element of a classic coup d'etat. My mother worked in the Pentagon. She was 5 levels above top security. She had clearance to go into the war room. She was the highest paid woman employee of the Pentagon for 30 years. She worked under the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. Her job was a manpower analyst. She didn't know everything. Ellsberg was 15 levels above top security. At every level he reached, he realized there was another when he brought them into that. That's classic control. It's the way any cult or secret society operates. You have concentric levels of knowledge and need to know and exclusion and people going up. But she was fairly high up, especially for a woman, and she provided them with figures. These figures were based on actuarial tables and combat death projections she was given by the Joint Chiefs. The purpose was to take a current force level, troops in the military, a future force level they wanted to be at down the pike, and to project in the intervening years how many would die non-combat, how many would retire, how many would re-enlist, how many enlist anew, how many discharge under each category, and therefore how many did you have to draft each year in order to get the troop level you wanted. She projected the annual national draft call figures for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those were given to selective service and used in state by state and then local board quotas in those years up until the time of the draft lottery. She had to project that figure on the national annual scale right within 100 people either way. 100 people either way when you had calls of up to 50,000 people a year. She had to project that figure that accurately 5 years in advance. My mother sweated the figures that came in each year because they were from 5 years before to figure out if she'd made the right projections. And she was consistently on target. They went off target when they replaced her with computers. She did a good job for them. She was there from 1942 to 1972, 30 years of service for the Joint Chiefs. After she retired in 1975, after long arguments about the validity of the Vietnam War, and her admission to me finally that it was a genocidal war, that she hated the napalm and the civilian deaths that she had been a part of, I asked her, when did they tell you they would escalate? Because she had to be among the first to know. I give you this story so you no longer have to go in endless debate between John Newman, Peter Dale Scott, and Noam Chomsky about National Security Memoranda 275 or 276, whether Kennedy had any intention to pull out of Vietnam. She told me that in the spring of 1963, she was given figures to begin a troop withdrawal by the end of that year that would end with all U.S. troops out by the end of 1964, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff directly down from the presidency. I said, when did they escalate? She said, late November of '63. I said, the last week. Kennedy's dead on Friday, the 22nd. She said, the Monday following the assassination. I said, a few more advisors. She said, I couldn't believe the figures. I took them back to the Joint Chiefs, and I said, these can't be right. The first civilian protest to the war in Vietnam. November 25, 1963, Kennedy just in the grave, you know, probably not even buried yet, sitting in the casket. They told her a war in Vietnam would begin then to last 10 years with 57,000 American dead. Your future doesn't belong to you. It's not planned by you. It's planned at other levels. That day, I talked to people in the Strategic Air Command, the pilots that were in the air the hour of the Kennedy assassination, responsible for the defense of the United States. If there was an attack in the United States, these are the planes that get the encrypted signals to go to failsafe, to carry on nuclear war, to do whatever is necessary for emergency response. Strategic Air Command, in the air, out of Kansas City on a 8-hour shift. They're up 24 hours. Radio chatter that the president has been shot in Dallas. The pilots go where? For their code books. The thing that will tell them whether they're getting a legitimate message and what the message means. The code books are in lockers. 2 of them have to undo the key, open it up. To a plane, they told me, there was not a code book aboard. There's no mafia goon in New Orleans. There's no anti-Castro hothead in Miami. There's no CIA schlepper working for E. Howard Hunt that can touch those damn books. That's 16 hands on and off the plane. That means that if there was a nuclear attack that hour, there would have been no defense. That means the defense of the United States was compromised at the time of the Kennedy assassination. That is Joint Chiefs of Staff. Who developed Strategic Air Command? The Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Curtis LeMay, who later sat watching from the teaching seats. You know, they had an open morgue at Bethesda, and they had teaching bleachers. And Hume said to Paul O'Connor, who was working on Kennedy's head, a young intern, when he saw someone sitting up in the stands with his arms folded, grinning, smoking a cigar, run over and tell that SOB, Humes is the commander in charge, tell that SOB with the cigar to get the hell out of here. O'Connor went halfway and saw who it was and ran back. Did you tell him what I said? He said, Commander Hume, that's General Curtis LeMay. He said, my God, you didn't say anything to him, did you? Shoup was at his physical that day from the Marines, but Maxwell Taylor was in-house. So was the head of the Navy. The entire communication system in the Pentagon, according to my mother and my aunt who worked there, intergovernmental phones, not your regular phone system, the phones from one government agency to another went dead for a period of 2 hours starting 12:30 at the time of the shooting. Okay? It would have been 1:30, I guess, Eastern Standard Time, or whatever the time difference was, but at the time of the shooting, the phones go dead. The government offices can't communicate. Where's the cabinet at this time of crisis? They're flying back from a major meeting in Honolulu about what? The fate of the Vietnam War. They come back with a recommendation for a 10-year war implemented by the Joint Chiefs, worked out there, to a new president who signs it that weekend and puts it into effect. That plane, according to Pierre Salinger in his book, does not have a code book aboard, incommunicado with the cabinet. You see, this is, if you read the book Coup d'etat by Edward Luttwak, who's an advisor to Reagan and no friend of mine, but he knows how it works. And in Handbook, Coup d'etat Handbook, he lays out how you do a coup d'etat. This is how you do it. You strip the security. The 112th Military Intelligence Group in the Dallas area that would have had responsibility for the presidency and backup for Secret Service there at the plaza is ordered off, not needed. Don't send the troops in that day. You pull the security off. You compromise the communications. The black box that links the president to the stacked bombers, what they call a nuclear football, has to be with the president 24 hours a day, disappears in Dallas for a period of nearly 8 hours before it gets... Johnson's already back to the White House before black box control is in his hands. Someone else is in charge of the country. And just this month, I learned from a researcher here in Texas, Richard Bartholomew, does very good work, that he asked some other SAC pilots he met. They not only confirmed my story about the day Kennedy killed, they said, we remember another day when there were no code books aboard. March 31, 1981. the day of the attempted murder of Ronald Reagan. Watch the lieutenant who has the black box in his hand behind Reagan, if you ever get to see the footage again. He drops to the ground at the time of the shooting, gets up when it's finished, and runs away from the limousine. According to the articles later in the Washington Post, control doesn't return for 5 hours. And they come back not to return the box, but to get the plastic card in Reagan's wallet that would give them communication control. An argument ensues because the FBI, who have taken it from the clothes on the floor, call up William Sullivan to ask if it's okay to give it to the Secret Service. Sullivan's not at headquarters. He's down in the command and control room in the White House. He's down there with the appointment secretary. And he's down there with Alexander Haig, who had to come up a little later and remind us who was in charge. And they're having an argument down there, I believe, about whether Reagan is going to live or die. Reagan's not yet at the hospital, you know, in the first few minutes after, but they're down there, and he goes over, and Sullivan says, don't give him the card, hang on to it. Something's going on in terms of transition of power that day. Something went on in Dealey Plaza and in the levels of government on November 22nd, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald, manipulated, I believe, and perhaps a witting agent for some period of time of the Office of Naval Intelligence, is positioned as the patsy in the crime. There is no hard evidence that Oswald owned the rifle or pistol that he's claimed to have done the shooting of either JFK or Tippit with. There's no hard evidence that he ran the P.O. box through which they were ordered. There's no hard evidence that he had those weapons with him the day of the shooting. There's no hard evidence that holds up for chain of command on those weapons or the bullets that's supposed to have come out of them. There's no hard evidence to even place Oswald on the 6th floor. There's no evidence in the paraffin tests on his cheek of him having fired a weapon that day. There's a little bit of graphite on his hand. You know, I think they meant to kill him in the Texas theater. He put his hand down the breech of the gun. I think the police brought the gun because they could link it to him by a P.O. box. I told that to a couple of Dallas cops at the ASS convention last year. They kind of grinned at each other and said, well, we might have brought it. They set him up as what he said he was, a patsy. He's innocent of the crime. History has yet to absolve him. Most of the researchers say, well, maybe he was one of the shooters. There had to be another. The evidence of 7 witnesses places him downstairs on the 1st and 2nd floor. He didn't have enough time to get over to shoot Tippit. He didn't have enough time to come downstairs. From the time of the shooting till the cop ran in for an inexplicable reason, this guy Baker, I mean, I can give you a reason, I think, but this is the scenario. He's in the motorcade, he's escorting the president, he hears the shots, he sees some pigeons fly off a building. He identifies that as the place the shots must have come from. You know, pigeons would know not to jump if it was a couple feet away. So the pigeons go, and he runs into the book depository building, and he sees Roy Truly, the manager, and he says, I want to go up to the 5th or 6th floor. And they start running up the stairs together. He shows them the way. He gets up to the 2nd floor, and he's passing a closed door, a little glass porthole or plastic porthole. He looks through the porthole, and he sees Lee Harvey Oswald. What's he doing? Drinking a Coke. What does he do? Stops running up the stairs toward the presumed area that he was looking for, kicks the door open, pulls his gun, and aims it at Oswald, who's still nonplussed, gives him probably a little strange, quizzical look as he's coming through the door, gun drawn. Truly at that point interrupts and says, he's okay, he works here. You think maybe they were all given a picture of Oswald that morning and told that this is the guy we're supposed to pick up? I mean, what on earth possessed him to go after a guy for drinking a Coke in the snack bar when he was supposedly heading for the top floors where he just heard a murder of the president go on? We don't get any explanation. We just see this little scenario, and Oswald still doesn't leave the building. You know, he's barely avoided capture if he's the assassin. He hangs around for quite a bit more before he goes downstairs, and he's quite polite getting over to his rooming house. He gives the cab to someone else in front of him. You know, he's in no hurry, and we don't have time to get him over there to do this. So I believe that he's innocent. I think history will show that he's innocent. I think the real murderers were well ensconced. I think that the fatal bullet came not from the infamous grassy knoll, but from a storm sewer to the right front of the motorcade. I give you a great deal of reason why I believe that's the case. But among other things, Kennedy's body is lifted up out of the seat, not pushed down. The brain matter goes back and to the left. The brain fragments, skull fragments, hit Hargis, the policeman, hard enough through a leather jacket that he gets off his motorcycle and asks someone on the sidelines whether he himself has been shot. Segments of the brain are found on the south side of Elm Street, the other side of the street, to the left rear of the motorcade, 30 feet behind the motorcade, and a .45 slug is picked up in that area, as yet unidentified as far as I know. They say FBI agent, but somebody in a suit who's got photographs of him picking this slug up and pocketing it. That bullet never figures into any of the official stories. A bullet is taken. I think the guns that mattered were silenced. I think the guns that were heard were distraction. I think people fired from the knoll to make noise and smoke, just as they did from the book depository. But the guns that counted, they didn't want you to know where they were. And I sent Penn Jones years later a photograph of the Republican National Convention held here in Dallas, of the security pictured on UPI wires that day. You know what they were doing? They were sealing the manhole covers over the sewers in the area around. They know how they do it. You don't. That's all. You don't get it. So you don't look for it. And meanwhile, they have no security on Kennedy, and he's pulled off. Adolf Hitler came to power not only because of a transition in this wealth, but publicly because he got rid of his opposition. In the period of the final years of the Weimar Republic, there were, according to the Weimar government, 400 unsolved political murders. They said they knew they were political, they knew they were connected, but they just couldn't figure out who was doing them. Who were they? The labor leaders, the musicians, the critics, the professors at the schools who were teaching the wrong thing. The people who were being fired, the guy that wrote the book about them was fired from Heidelberg University for saying that a war memorial had the same worth as a turnip. Okay, and he wrote this book, 4 Years of War Lies, and then 4 Years of War Murders, about the propaganda that led into the war in Poland. You know how the war in Poland started? You know about Operation Canned Meat? The German soldiers in a covert operation went to the Polish border. They shot and murdered Polish border guards. They dressed the Polish border guards in German uniforms. They dragged them back across the border and claimed that the Poles had shot German border guards. Most wars are based on such stories. The Vietnam War that was escalated because of the attack on the ship in the Haiphong Harbor was a fabricated CIA operation in order to give an excuse. In fact, I think we probably should all join boating safety clubs as part of our way to stay out of war, since most wars start over what happens to ships someplace. And that's the excuse that we're given as to why we have to go to war. But you had hundreds of murders, and I would suggest that after the time of John F. Kennedy's assassination, that same sort of murder pattern emerged here in the United States. First with the key witnesses, people that knew that Oswald knew Ruby, were dead within a period of weeks. People that knew more about Oswald's background or were connected to other main characters in the case began to die. Penn Jones tracked them all through the 70s. 175 violent deaths. 30 new deaths at the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, including in one summer, in a 2-month period, the 5 main lab ballistic guys from the FBI that worked on the ballistic aspects of the Oswald and Kennedy situation, the people that basically told the lie, all dropping dead of heart attacks or falling downstairs and breaking their necks. Top CIA people that were about to be questioned, all of them start dropping like flies. The people that were close to the Oswald, supposedly killing themselves, like George de Mohrenschildt. Oswald was painted that day as a Red, as a Soviet defector, as a lover of Castro and communism. That was the story that we got. I think the reason that they defanged U.S. military response was that there were people below Joint Chiefs, not on the need to know, who might have reacted and said, my God, the commies did it, and started a war. There were also plans afoot in the first hours to use this, along with this pro-Castro element who had killed Kennedy, as an excuse to invade Cuba. They involved the CIA. They involved the anti-Castro Cubans. They involved the mob. They involved them very cleverly. They used them in such a way, I believe, so that each of those different groups would take not only responsibility but credit for the murder. so that each one would go home and slap themselves in the back and say, we got the SOB. And so that later they could be given the blame. That's what I say. The fingers wiggle in front of you. You get different ones at different times. The first person to say that Castro did it was Frank Sturgis to the Warren Commission, later one of the Watergate burglars, one of the great liars of American history and part of the assassination. And Sturgis died strangely himself. I don't know if you know, he was named in a Cuban documentary, TV documentary, that came out last December. And they named Sturgis as one of the killers. Of course, he's been pointed at before, but they were saying they were going to release all the Cuban files, and it was in the news. His name was getting around in connection with the case again. And his attorney down in Miami, I think that was November 28th, December the 4th, his obituary appears. And his attorney is quoted in Miami as saying that he had a cough, he went into the VA hospital, he thought he had a respiratory problem, and 5 days later he was dead of cancer. 27 of the key witnesses in the Kennedy case died of a galloping cancer that took their lives in under 6 weeks. 27. David Ferry, Oswald's friend in New Orleans, if he can be called a friend, was working on rats as part of an experiment to inject cancer cells or feed cancer cells into rats to see if cancer could be induced into organisms. Cancer was a specialty all the way back to Nazi Germany. Kurt Blome, a Nazi biological warfare expert who knew about cancer as a weapon from 1936 on, was brought in 1956 to Fort Detrick, Maryland, the head place for biological warfare in the United States, to help train Americans about the use of cancer as a weapon, as a technique for death. Okay? And the same cancer that killed Jack Ruby is the cancer that killed Martha Mitchell. It's a very vile melanoma. It's very fast acting. Both of them complained to friends before their death of being given painful injections. One of the sheriff's office people here went into the hospital here in Dallas for a broken leg. He was present at the finding of the gun. He saw the pickup of the .45 slug. He was in on the Oswald arrest. He died of cancer in 6 weeks. Or I'm sorry, no, 6 days. He went in for a broken leg, and 6 days later he was dead of cancer. Okay. So I think they have a highly metastasizing form of cancer that they can use. Other people died very violent and unusual deaths. Robert Kennedy said that he was going to scatter the CIA to the four winds. I'm sorry, John Kennedy said he was going to scatter the CIA to the four winds. And Robert Kennedy was to be put in as head of the CIA at a time when these Nazis were the predominant element. In other words, Galen's network was full force at that period, and he was going to go in and clean it out if Kennedy had made this transition. This is what was being planned in the last weeks before his life ended. Robert Kennedy told friends that he was going to reopen the case when he got in the White House. But he said he knew that guns stood between him and the presidency. But he vowed that he'd open his brother's case. And he was murdered by not Sirhan. Sirhan, in each of these cases, I have a modus operandi, is what I call it, throughout these. And in each case, there's too many bullets. You can't account from one gun. There's bullets from the wrong direction. You can't account it from the position of the supposed assassin. You have botched or no autopsies. It was just in the news the other day, I brought a clipping with me, about Jerry Francesca. He's in Memphis. He's the county coroner. Another Elvis inquiry. Elvis may be dead, but investigations surrounding his demise continue to thrive. Chief Medical Examiner Joseph Davis in Dade County, Florida, has been hired by the Tennessee Department of Health to try to determine whether the medical examiner who signed Presley's death certificate, Jerry Francisco, lied about the cause of death. Jerry Francisco is the guy that was supposed to have done the autopsy on Martin Luther King. But Francisco said that it would mar the body, and he didn't want to trouble the family, and so he never cut into King's flesh to determine the root of the bullet. Okay. These coroners show up over and over. I've got numerous examples of these people coming in and fouling the crime and what was supposed to be a regular autopsy. You wouldn't give a barnyard animal the autopsy that John F. Kennedy was given at Bethesda Hospital. No thorough examination, no cardinal points, no sectioning of the brain to figure the position of the bullets, wounds not even examined, wounds examined and not explained as closure wounds in the back that didn't go anywhere. you know, and just these ridiculous conclusions. I mean, almost as if, you know, their conclusion was, I guess the guy's dead, and I guess he's got a shot to the head. You know, I mean, it wasn't standard work, but you have this kind of control and manipulation over the evidence. You have a problem in each case with the physical evidence that shows that there were at least 2 assassins. In almost every case, the bullets of the alleged assassin are not the ones that did the murder. None of Sirhan's bullets hit Robert F. Kennedy. None of Hinckley's bullets hit Ronald Reagan. None of James O. Ray's bullets hit Martin Luther King, because Ray wasn't even in the rooming house or firing a gun at the time, and the shots didn't come from the rooming house. They came across the street. All the witnesses put them there. That's where everybody's pointing in that photo. If you go up to the Lorraine and get on that balcony and point where they're standing, they're pointing straight across the street, the things at an angle. So they tell you, oh, there they are pointing at the window, Jesse Jackson and his friends pointing at the rooming house. The cops didn't go into the rooming house for an hour and a half. That wasn't where everybody was telling them to go. The people down below King, Earl Carter, who drove his limousine, the lawyer standing down there, heard the shot zing over their heads to the right side of their ear. Well, this shot would have come to their left and well above them. You wouldn't have heard the zing of the shot. It was directly over their heads and to their right. Guy Joseph Lowy, standing down the balcony, saw King hit, and the other people saw him from the ground. He was lifted up off the balcony, not driven down, lifted up off the balcony. He's leaning over, shot hits him, takes him up in the air, and then twirls him to his right. Well, the shot from over here would have twirled him to his left, and it would have driven him down. So all the body reactions are wrong. The gross characteristics of the bullets don't match. Then we get lost guns. We get duplicated files, you know, and you can't find the original bullets. The bullets disappear. You have too many bullets. I found evidence of 17 bullets in 25 years in the John F. Kennedy case alone. 17, but you count the wounds and the marks in the car and the marks in the street, the Stemmons Road sign, the bullets reported at Bethesda, you know, the bullets found at Parkland. You might say, you know, okay, cut it down to 13 because some of them might have been the same bullet. You know, you've only got 3 bullets, you know. If Oswald was doing it, he had to be the greatest sport in history. You know, the clip holds 6. You're going to kill the president, you just take 3 bullets. Well, maybe I'll get him, maybe I won't. Don't worry about return fire. You know, but he's supposed to have taken 3 bullets, all he needed, and kill the President of the United States and wound Connally and do all the stuff that they said he had done. But I followed these deaths throughout that period and since. Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, also similar evidence of being surrounded by intelligence, false security. Although the ballistics aren't wrong, probably, in Malcolm's death. It was 3 different people that shot him. Their backgrounds have never been explored. The one that talked about a conspiracy was paroled from prison and dead within a week, shot in the head in a still unsolved homicide in the subways in New York. And there were specific documents in the FBI that talked about getting rid of black leadership in this country, not allowing the rise of black messiahs, as they called them, who could lead people or take them in any other direction than they wanted them to go. I did not only exhaustive work on these main ones, but ones like Ronald Reagan, not a person that I even liked. But I think when the president's shot, you have to take a look at what happens. And I did exhaustive work. I can go into it in the section, but I want to jump from this to the mass level of control, because I haven't yet, I realize, talked about Jonestown and these other situations like Waco, and now this new cult that was, an attempt was made to burn them down in Switzerland and in Canada. I think these cults, for the large part, are either created whole cloth or infiltrated and manipulated by the intelligence agencies for their purposes. I started to look into the Jonestown deaths in the days following the original report in the New York Times. I was in New York, and the headline was, I don't know if you recall this, 400 found dead in jungle, 700 flee into the jungle. 400 found dead, and 700 flee into the jungle. Now, I later found reports in all the People's Temple magazines, in all the press, in the passport levels, 800 adult passports and 300 children, adding up to 11 or 1,200 people on site. So this made sense, 7 and 4, 1,100. accounted for. 400 dead. How did they count? The Guianese Defense Force that went in was responsible on site in a jungle, all these dead bodies, for poking them with their bayonets and making holes in their bodies so that their gases wouldn't explode the bodies before they got them out of the area. Do you think somebody doing that gruesome work would fail to notice one body next to or under another? There were 5 official versions given by the military eventually to explain it. The first version to explain the problem that they had was that the Guianese can't count. They don't have 10 digits on their fingers like we do. They never heard of mathematics. The Guianese can't count. Official U.S. Army intelligence statement on site in Jonestown the first day that they get there with the Green Berets. They brought in 300 Green Berets. Only 100 were used in the cleanup. The other 200 had a different job to do. Okay, but the first thing that made me question it was you had 405 or 408, depending on which count you take, dead bodies, the majority of them children, at least 2/3 children. That's the first count. Elderly and children, and they're dead, and there's 408 or 405 of them. 5 days later, you have 915 bodies, and that becomes the final official body count. What's wrong with the scenario? We're told, if you remember, the second lie, bodies fell on top of bodies. Well, let's have them fall. You have 400 bodies, including mostly children underneath, and then you have over 500 bodies, so you can get up to 915. How do the 400 bodies, how can they cover all these other bodies? I mean, wouldn't it be the other way around, that the 500 would cover the 400, you get an extra 100 on the count on the outside? But we're told that they cover the bodies. Then the third lie, 3 days in, bodies fell in piles. They died in little groups and they fell in piles and we just couldn't count them right. Okay, I mean, all this is going on. We're not being told much except that more bodies each day, you get a larger count. This many have died, this many have died. None of the bodies are being taken back. They have star lifters in there that can carry tanks and troops and everything else, these huge planes, and they're telling us they can only get 11 caskets off site per trip. It costs millions of dollars to make all these extra trips with these huge planes they couldn't fit the caskets on. Couldn't move the bodies out. It took 6 days there in the jungle to get these bodies off the site. It's a special team, crisis team goes in, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, Center for Disease Control. They have these special military intelligence teams that go in crises. They're present on site, and you're getting these stories. I looked at probably 150 photographs, close photographs on the ground, every aerial photograph I could find, every news source photograph I could find. I challenge you to find me one photograph of one body at Jonestown on top of one other body in any photograph. These people are laid in neat rows. In the closer photos, you can see the drag marks. They're laid face down. In some cases, 3 or 4 along on a blanket or a sheet are dragged along and positioned. They are in calm repose. They're face down. Most of them you can't see the face. Their arms are at their side or relaxed. And we're told that they died how? By taking cyanide in a little cup because their minister told them to, and then dying of cyanide. Know anything about cyanide? You know how it kills you? It's a cholinesterase inhibitor. It stops the neural signals from going to the muscles. Doesn't stop them completely. You start getting random signals. Not only your voluntary, but the involuntary and back brain. So you're not getting breath when you want breath, or you're getting a lot of breath when you don't want. Okay? You're jerking. What are the 2 major signs of cyanide pathology that somebody would look for? Spasming of the limbs. The limbs are going to end up jerked in a spasmed position. Find me one. Number 2, common to all the bodies, cyanide rictus that lasts all the way through the rigor mortis. They were there within a few hours. They would have seen it. Cyanide rictus, a sardonic death grin. It's not anywhere on those faces. These people didn't die of cyanide. Dr. Mutu, the leading Guianese pathologist, went into there first. He looked at the 408 bodies. He helped to count them. and he was a medical doctor, and he saw how they died, and he reported on it. He reported on it to the Guyanese press, which I found. He reported on it to the Guyanese grand jury at Matthews Ridge, which I found the transcript of, and eventually reported on it to the American Pathological College Association in meetings of pathologists here in the United States, which was reported on in Reader's Digest even. They died from an unknown poison injected at the back of the left shoulder blade. They found bent needles, forced injection evidence, and the rest of them that didn't die from whatever the hell this injection was, died, he said, from gunfire or strangulation. I can show you the gunfire wounds in the photos that I looked at. And they died over a period of 5 to 6 days. 408 dead, 700 flee into the woods. Who was in the woods? Who was in the jungle? 300 British Black Watch troops, the equivalent of our Green Berets, on maneuvers that day. Guyanese Defense Force, 500 strong. Where were their officers trained? The International Police Academy, headed by CIA agent Dan Mitrione, trained those Guyanese officers. They were surrounding them. You'll see them during the murder of Leo Ryan in the footage, the congressman killed there. They're watching a group of people pull up on a flatbed truck with shotguns, shooting at people at a distance and then walking slowly. They're described as robotic, programmed without affect, blank stare, looking through you rather than at you, programmed killers, walking through, turning people over, looking at their faces, and selectively blowing off the heads of certain ones, including Leo Ryan. Other wounded people left alone to live. Selected targets. Guyanese Defense Force, no further away than the second row back there from this operation. You can see them in the photos and see them in the films, sitting at tents, machine guns at the ready, doing nothing. Part of the operation. And the extra 200 Green Berets. We met one of them in Texas. He pulled out a serrated knife this long, and he said, "This is what we used on them in Guyana." These people were dragged back dead. They were rounded up and killed in the woods and dragged onto site, and that's why it took 6 days to do the killing and then the cover-up. The last lie told on the 6th day by the U.S. Army official spokesperson, "We forgot to go around the back of the pavilion." The pavilion isn't even a quarter the size of this room. We forgot to go around the back of the pavilion for 6 days. And when we went around, we found 500 new bodies. And this is in print. I'm not making this stuff up. This is how we were told about the Jonestown deaths. But these were not suicides. They weren't even the new term. What's the new term? You've seen it. Here's Switzerland. 48 die in cult murder-suicide. I hope you don't ever die of a murder-suicide, because that's why you pay a coroner. It isn't the same thing. It's not a joint double word. You're either dead from murder or you're dead from suicide. One of my favorite autopsies was accidental asphyxiation by hanging. They told us the guy was trying to masturbate. I mean, they had a case in Baltimore where a guy supposedly hit himself over the head 36 times with a ball-peen hammer. And he just kept waking up and whacked long enough till he finally died. They had one guy, they ruled it a suicide. His body parts were tied in a bag. I mean, this guy had nothing. Houdini was nothing compared to this character. You better distinguish between a murder and a suicide. It's not the same thing. I can't find an instance in human history of a voluntary mass suicide by anyone. They showed Masada after Jonestown, where the Jews are supposed to have formed a suicide pact. But Josephus, the Roman historian, says, no, there were a few suicides, half a dozen, the Romans killed the rest. That's the way it happens. People don't agree. And that's in a critical situation. These people are just hanging around the jungle. Now, they had suicide drills. They had suicide drills. But they knew that they were drills. And the way they knew, I was told by one of the survivors, the way they knew something was up, the day of the Jonestown murders, was that the cook was brought out. And it was almost dinner time, and the cook was brought out for the suicide drill. Well, then they knew they weren't going to eat. So maybe it wasn't a drill. And then they headed for the woods. Except they were surrounded in part by the white armed guard of the concentration camp called Jonestown, the socialist paradise that we're told about by Mark Lane and Don Freed, One too many Jonestowns would have been Martin Luther King's next agenda, we're told. This was a slave camp. They found, the Guyanese Defense Force found in the lockers enough drugs to drug the entire population of Georgetown, Guyana, 120,000 people for a period longer than a year, being used on 11,000 people. They found enough doses of Thorazine, which is one control drug, you know, the Thorazine shuffle from the psychiatric wards, used as a punishment drug according to the survivors. Enough doses in one footlocker, like, you know, 11,000 doses of Thorazine, enough for everybody in the camp to have one. Okay. I mean, they found prodigious amounts of the control drugs, no medical records, those had all been destroyed. Stories that if anyone got cut or hurt or injured, they were taken immediately away and never returned. There was a camp doctor with no medical training. His last name was Schacht, S-C-H-A-C-H-T, Lawrence Schacht, Houston, Texas. I believe he's the grandson of the Schacht family that moved there from Nazi Germany. Hjalmar Schacht, Reichsminister of Economics, invented the phrase, Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free, on the gate to Auschwitz and the concentration camps.